So it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Mark Roseland. Mark is the director of the Center for Sustainable Community Development and a professor in the School of Resource and Environmental Management at Simon Fraser University. Mark has been cited, and this is interesting, has been cited by the Vancouver Sun as one of British Columbia's top 50 living public intellectuals.
The key word is living.
That's pretty good on both counts, I mean. So under his leadership, the center provides research, training, and advisory services to the sustainable community development sector in BC, in Canada as well, and internationally. Dr. Roseland lectures internationally and advises communities and governments on sustainable development policy and planning. He chairs the Community Advisory Committee of the Simon Fraser University Community Trust, which is responsible for the University City, that's City, Sustainable Community Development Project. He also teaches courses on sustainable community development that have focused extensively on projects such as the City of Vancouver's Model Sustainable Community being developed at Southeast False Creek, and SFU's University project, the Vancouver Whistler 2010 Olympic bid, and the City of Vancouver's proposed sustainability precinct. Dr. Roseland has published widely, and this is a great example of what I was saying earlier about the importance of being able to do first-rate academic scholarly work applicable to the problems of the real world. He's published very widely. He sold over 20,000 copies of his book towards sustainable communities, resources for citizens and their governments. It's in circulation internationally. It was first published by the Government of Canada's National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy, and it's been revised and updated. Dr. Roseland also his teaching has a direct impact on sustainable community development through his focus on research topics for his students that address current planning and development issues. So would you join me, please, in welcoming Dr. Roseland?
Good afternoon, and thank you, Scott and Jeff, for inviting me. I'm quite honored to be here, and thanks to all of you for being here today. I'm sure you had some other less interesting options. So I know you haven't had a chance to ask any questions yet today, and I'm concerned about that because as soon as I finish, I have to find a phone booth, change into a different costume, and take a flight. So I'm going to start with questions. There's my title, Sustainable Community Development, Economic Development as if Sustainability Mattered. And that's what I'm going to talk about for the next 45 minutes. But if you have questions now, we'll see if we can deal with some of those. Yes, in the back.
We got a card highlighting your book, and the pictures are all urban. Does this book also apply to rural communities?
Yes, it does. So
Elaborate on that?
I will shortly. Good, thank you. Yes, you do have cards on your table. In the very back by the window.
How is the effect of the retiring boomer generation going to impact on this whole field?
Good question. I'm probably not going to give a good answer for that, but we'll see if we can have some question time at the end, too. Other questions? Anybody else? Okay. So, as I said, I'm sort of giving away the punchline in the title so that we can try to do that. But let me deal with that first question. So yes. Oops, I didn't word this way. So much for my clicker, which worked a minute ago. So yes, I'm from the big city, and that's Vancouver if you haven't seen it, but I want to quickly make the point that while many of the examples and that I will talk about are urban, and including pictures on the cover of my book, I haven't always been from the big city. Indeed, I used to live there for many years, actually. So I lived on 40 acres of forest land, cut my own trees, milled them into lumber, built a house from scratch, I have an appreciation for rural life. So part of the reason I use the term communities, rather than a lot of other people in this field use terms like sustainable cities and urban sustainability, I deliberately use the term sustainable communities in recognition of the fact that a lot of rural people get their backs up when they see all of these urban images. So I just want to establish my rural credibility here. So my whole career has been dedicated to working against some of these perceptions. So Derek Bach, the former president of Harvard, it's always the former presidents who are enlightened, said most universities continue to do their least impressive work on the very subjects where society's need for greater knowledge and better education is most acute. And that's really why my center was founded, because that's ridiculous. Clark Kerr, who for many years was the president of the University of California system, is reported to have said at one point, a university is a collection of faculty entrepreneurs united by a common grievance over parking. So we need to do better than that. My center was actually founded in 1989 as the Community Economic Development Center. And we can talk later about why the name was changed, but I think it'll be clear. We always understood community economic development as a means to achieve sustainable development. But we didn't feel like the sector was sort of approaching it quite the same way. So in 2004, we renamed it the Center for Sustainable Community Development. And you've heard people today talking about sustainability and sustainable community development. There are all kinds of wonderful things happening under that name now, but in 2004, we were the only ones doing that, and it was kind of risky. People were saying, "Are you sure you want to do this? Like, this might be really a dead end," but we were sure. So our focus is on integrating economic, social, and environmental objectives in community development through these three pillars of research, education, and what we call community mobilization. So again, the mission, as Scott said, is to enable the sustainable development of communities in BC, Canada, and around the world through research, education, and community mobilization. And we offer a variety of academic, professional, and outreach programs. So that said, what's the context we're dealing with here? Well, really, without being too glib, it's this. We're floating around in a little fleck in space, and we don't have a sort of a really reverent perspective about how delicate this is. We know that we're on this fragile planet, and I'm going to apologize here. I'm going to do 20 seconds of David Suzuki, but don't get too depressed. It's just really important that we not skip this. So we know that climate change, for example, is happening. There's all kinds of concerns, images like this. And very, very important concerns in terms of electricity, in terms of floods, drought, agriculture, groundwater, water quality, water use, low-lying lands, habitats, et cetera. So we've got all of that sort of environmental stuff that we really need to pay attention to. It's not good enough to simply say we have to do business as usual and then worry about the environment. Things are a bit better today than they were 3 years ago when these headlines appeared in the Vancouver Sun business section. Trouble with the economy, Canadian economy shrinks, stock market tumbles, hard times are here, Canada. But they're not so different. If you look on the front page of the business section of today's Globe and Mail, you'll see something about Eurozone malaise sparks investor anxiety. So we've got anxiety there. The Americans are so concerned they've even changed their money. And then we also have enormous issues around equity, social equity, which really is an academic term for fairness. So this is a picture of an 8-year-old girl in Bangladesh looking for clean water. And Bangladesh, as you probably know, is a very low-lying country that really is at risk of tremendous devastation from climate change, never mind the economic difficulties that they have now. So we have this is a map that I think is quite useful. You don't see this one very often, but if you look at countries scaled according to their cumulative carbon emissions over the last half century, you can see where the problem is. It's not population and consumption in Africa or Latin America. It is North America is really, the United States in particular has 4.5% of the world's population, consumes 20% of the resources. That's simply unsustainable. But it's not just on a national or country basis. You all were very aware of this last fall, the Occupy movement. So people are very concerned about equity, not only globally between countries, but within our own countries. I was quite moved by this poster. If you can't read it in the back, it says, "This is not the world our parents wanted for us, and not the one we want for our kids." And I think many of us feel that way. So you look at these three crises together, the ecological, the economic, and the social, and it may well seem like the world is crashing down around us. And a lot of us would be feeling something like this character, and I know you can't read it in the back, but because I was sitting there before, but he's saying, "My house is too big to heat, and it's too far from work that I drive to in a car that's too large, fueled by gas that's too expensive, and the money just goes to terrorists who want to attack the way I live. And I'm too tired for irony." So I think it was JP was that this morning who talked about sustainable development, and I covered some of the ground here. Does anybody here have a birthday today? Good. I was going to say, go get a life if you do. But if sustainability has a birthday, it would be this year. It would be 25. Because 25 years ago, the United Nations World Commission on Environment and Development, chaired by then Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland of Norway, popularized the term sustainable development in their report, Our Common Future. And the Brundtland report set the stage for, among other things, the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, which at its time was the largest ever gathering of presidents and prime ministers. There were 178 governments gathered in Rio in 1992, and they signed onto a non-binding resolution called Agenda 21 to support sustainability and environmental responsibility as part of efforts to fight poverty worldwide. So the Brundtland report sparked a whole generation of thinking and action around sustainability that we've seen evidence of this morning. In some ways, it's on the verge of becoming truly mainstream. I meant to ask, how many of you are sustainability professionals? No, okay. How many of you are economic development professionals? Okay, how many are you with NGOs? Government? Other private firms? Other. Okay, you're mostly other. We'll have to, Scott and Jeff, you need to find out who these people are. Anyway, there are a whole lot of people these days who have positions as sustainability officers, as VP sustainability, as chairs of sustainability programs, who are getting degrees in sustainability or sustainable development or sustainable community development, things we couldn't have imagined 25 years ago. So the Brundtland report really sparked all of that. So this year, 2012, is the 20th anniversary of the Rio Summit and of Agenda 21. And it's an obvious time for reflection about our past and future. Some of these reflections are very heartening, and some are more disturbing. In British Columbia, for example, local sustainability officers, like local economic development officers, are telling me that they feel under siege. And this is in part, in my view, because the movement after 25 years is kind of tired of continually having to define itself. But we stopped doing that at our peril. So I won't go into a huge, long rant about this, but there are hundreds, if not over 1,000 publications now that have something to do with the definition of sustainability or sustainable development. And again, it came up this morning, and people are still struggling with this. And there's continuous debate, and there are criticisms, for example, that it's vague, or that it fosters delusions, or it attracts hypocrites, or it's context specific. So what is it that we're sustaining, and why? Are we trying to sustain poverty? Well, no, of course not. The fact that it's contested is often used as a reason to disregard it. Say, okay, well, people disagree about it, so let's not bother with it because we don't have a shared definition. Well, do you know, that's the most ridiculous thing, because what else is contested in our society? Truth, justice, beauty, democracy, so many things that we cherish are contested. So the fact that it's been contested and debated so vigorously for 25 years tells me that sustainable development is actually quite robust. Still, when people in public life, and I know you've got an MP coming, is he here yet? Okay, so good, I'll give you the questions for him now. Oftentimes, people in public life, when they use the term sustainable development, what they really mean simply is environmental protection. Or what they mean is economic growth, presumably to pay for, among other things, environmental protection. And I want to suggest to you that neither of those interpretations is sufficient to the task at hand. Virtually all of the definitions of sustainable development that make any sense have three core elements. The first is hard to do, but conceptually it's easy. It's that environmental considerations must be entrenched in and constrain economic decisions and policymaking. Again, hard to do, but everybody gets what that is. The second is more difficult, and that's an inescapable commitment to social equity, as I said, fairness. But that's not just social equity between the so-called developed and developing worlds, it's also social equity within our own countries and our own communities, and equity between those of us who are here now and future generations. And that's really difficult because they're not at the table to speak for themselves. And the third notion that's really key here is that despite the fact that we interchange these words and confuse them, development does not simply equal growth. Development is about better. Growth is about bigger. Sometimes better is bigger, sometimes better is smaller, sometimes better is the same size, but they're not the same concepts. And we really need to be careful when people equate them. So if you take nothing else away from this talk, it's that sustainable development is not about environmental protection or economic growth to pay for environmental protection. It's about doing development itself differently. And that's really the key. And if we're not clear about that, then it makes people who are working in this field, and a lot of people are blurring sustainability and economic development these days, it makes those people vulnerable. Because in tight economic times, if your role or your job is understood as an extra environmental cost to be traded against, you will be considered expendable. And actually, so you should be. But if we do sustainability well, we can demonstrate that sustainability is not about a green premium, it's actually about a green dividend. And I'll give you an example of this in a moment, but first, a bit of context. So, how many of you at some point in your lives have lived here? Hands higher, please. Right, and the rest of you are lying. So what's wrong with this picture? If we had time, I'd have you yell out some things, but here's the kinds of things that you would obviously say. We have high per capita energy use. We have high per capita per person automobile emissions. We know that both smog and greenhouse gases are directly related to the amount of gasoline that's used. We have high per capita water use for irrigation and for large lawns. We have high land requirements in both the block size and the road system required to service it. Road provision is 7 times greater in low-density areas than in medium-density areas. High stormwater pollution from the extra urbanized land. We know that low-density areas have double the stormwater pollution of medium-density areas. High domestic heating costs due at least in part to the lack of a shared insulating effect when buildings are grouped. We can see differences of up to 50%. Poor recycling rates, at least until recently, due to the cost involved in a sprawled versus a compact housing system. And again, until very recently, European cities had 4 to 6 times the recycling rates of North American cities. High physical infrastructure costs, pipes, utilities, roads, poles, all the things that economic developers and citizens and taxpayers and municipal politicians are concerned about. It's just stupid to do it this way. It's very inefficient and it's very expensive. But something we don't talk about nearly enough, which is high social infrastructure costs. Because when you build communities like this, which is the predominant form of development in North America, who are you excluding from participation? Come on, it's not that hard. Who? The poor, yes, who are mostly women. Who else? The disabled, yes. Who else? The youth and children. One more group. Seniors, right. So those 4 categories of people are the non-drivers. So you are excluding them from participation in your communities. Does that matter? Aside from the fact that some people are bleeding heart liberals, I mean, but is that we're talking about any significant numbers? Yes, we are talking about 40 to 60% of the population in our community. So basically, half the community being excluded from being able to participate when you build like this. So this planning issue of land use is very, very important. Now, in contrast, this is the place that Scott was having trouble pronouncing, University. It's a pun here, but so this is at Simon Fraser University, which, as you may know, is located on top of a mountain. The province, in its wisdom, 45 years ago, thought that would be a good idea. Nobody in their right mind would put a university on top of a mountain today. And I have spent much of my 20 years at Simon Fraser trying to compensate for the fact that the university is on top of a mountain. And one of the ways we're doing that is by building this new community, which will eventually house 10,000 people in an actual neighborhood, part of the city of Burnaby, next to the university. So I'm not going to talk about this much, other than to say that in this new development, we are opening a new childcare center, and actually the grand opening is tomorrow morning. It's one of the reasons I have to be back. Now, it's interesting. This childcare center is greener than LEED. If you know what LEED is, Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. This is the first building in Canada to be built to the Living Building Challenge standard. It generates as much energy as it uses. It recycles or collects more water than it consumes. It uses no toxic materials in construction or operation, and it's built from materials within a 500-kilometer radius. But that's the obvious stuff. Guess what else? On a square foot basis, this building cost 15% less to build than a conventional childcare center being built in the same region. That's the green dividend. So if we do it right, it's pretty great. So we all have various ways of marking key events in our lives, marriages and births, for example. For me, it's books, particularly my own. So looking back over the last 20 years, a key marker for me was the publication of the first edition of Towards Sustainable Communities in 1992. The book helped define and advance the concept and practice of sustainable communities in Canada and around the world. And one aspect of it that was somewhat novel at the time is that it included not only bibliographic references, but addresses, phone numbers, and email addresses for many organizations. By the time the second edition was published in 1998, every organization had a website. That wasn't true in 1992. How many of you marked time that way? The third edition came out in 2005, and I'm going to give you a brief overview of how it addresses community sustainability. So here's some examples of the kinds of initiatives that I track. So in Oslo, Norway, to drive your single occupant vehicle into the downtown core, you have to display a valid monthly transit pass in your windshield. It's a brilliant message about what you're being encouraged to do and what you're being discouraged to do. Vancouver is one of many cities now that has a climate action plan. In fact, Vancouver has committed itself formally to being the greenest city in the world by 2020, and it will have lots of competition. In Minneapolis, Minnesota, there are restrictions on packaging that's not reusable, returnable, or biodegradable. In California and now other places, there are water retrofit requirements. So a developer building a new subdivision, in California, has to go into existing adjoining subdivisions and retrofit all the shower heads and toilets so that there's no net increase in water consumption from the new development. In San Luis Obispo and many other places, streams are being daylighted. Vancouver, for example, had 50 salmon-bearing streams. They're almost all paved over, but many communities in Vancouver also are starting to dig those streets up and expose that habitat to fresh air and sunlight and reclaim that. Now, Ruth is here from Brabant, where I've been in the Netherlands, and so I'm apologize in advance for slaughtering my pronunciation of these names. But in a town called Zutphen, maybe, something that looks to me in English like sloopstraat, translates into a disassembly line, and it's an actually interesting kind of initiative where underemployed and at-risk young people work in a facility where they take appliances that would otherwise be going to the landfill, and they salvage them and refurbish them, and then they are sold, and those young people develop job skills. So that's the kind of thing that I have been tracking for a couple of decades now. So in my book, in the 2005 edition, I divide the sustainable community world up into a set of what I call building blocks. And I'm just going to very, very briefly go through these. In fact, really briefly, because I want to focus in on the economic development part. But greening the city, water and sewage, waste reduction and recycling, energy efficiency and renewables, atmospheric change and air quality, transportation and traffic management, land use and urban form, housing and community development, and community economic development. And again, I'm going to whip through these very quickly. So greening the city or greening the community refers to things like open space and community agriculture. I mean, people are starting to say, hey, we want to grow food in the downtown. We want to grow food on rooftops. There's all kinds of really interesting things with community gardens and living walls and food hubs and urban aquatic systems. So again, apologies again to the person who asked about how urban I am, but again, rural people have been doing this all along. For city people, this is new. Water and sewage. So there's really important issues both about water quantity and water quality. The photograph here is of a solar aquatic sewage treatment system. If you haven't heard of that, it's a really fascinating system that basically mimics the natural processes of a wetland or a marsh inside a greenhouse. And you're using cow wall fiberglass tanks, and you're using fish and algae to deal not only with sewage, but actually even septage, which is the really toxic stuff. So very exciting, interesting thing done on a neighborhood scale. Waste reduction and recycling, again, not time to talk about it very much, but we need to focus on source reduction, we need to focus on reuse, recycling and recovery, and different kinds of composting. Energy efficiency and renewables, we could spend a lot of time on this, but very important to focus not only on supply, but also on demand. Can we reduce demand? Can we do demand side management? Can we reinvest energy dollars saved in the local economy and recirculate it? This is really an important thing in terms of linking energy and economic development. Green building certification and rating systems, as I mentioned. Municipal energy policy is a very important part of the context here, renewable energy supply. This schematic is from the district energy system in the city of North Vancouver. But these things are becoming increasingly common. Atmospheric change and air quality. So there are obviously local air quality issues like smog and acid rain. There's ozone layer depletion where we have made some progress. And as I said earlier, climate change is now the major focus, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So that picture on your left is of Beijing. And I believe the one at the right is from Waterloo. Is that correct? Anybody? Yes. Yeah. So transportation planning and traffic management, also very important in understanding sort of the whole picture of a community. We're starting to understand the true economic costs of driving. It costs most of us $7,000 or $8,000 a year to own that vehicle, and that's actual cash out of pocket for insurance and gas and all of that. But that's not thinking about roads and traffic courts and police and pollution and stress and poor health. So there's lots there that's not being counted. Technical fixes like electric cars are tempting, but that's only a short interim step. We really need to focus on reducing automobile dependency, and that's a key theme in the book. And you can only do that if you focus on land use and urban form, because land use and transportation are inextricably linked. We need to be paying attention to housing and density and changing the patterns of growth. There's a knee-jerk reaction oftentimes where people just want to stop growth. And I can't remember whose presentation it was this morning. Again, it might have been JP's or somebody else, but the notion of moratoria or just stopping growth, that's really not what we want. We didn't get into this situation overnight. It's going to take a while to build our way out. And if we freeze where we are, we're freezing ourselves into a very unsustainable pattern. So we need to pay a lot of attention to changing the pattern of growth. Housing and community development. Affordable housing is really a key part of this picture. Integrating community sustainability, integrating all kinds of people. I'd sort of intrigued because it's my first time here in Kingston, but you have a very, those of you who are Kingston focused, you have a very unique population in terms of you've got the prison families and the ex-prisoners who have settled here, and so making sure that you have an economy that works for them as well as for professionals and people with more established positions. And then what I want to really focus on more today is community economic development, which is really about redefining development, focusing more on local self-reliance, and thinking about green business and the green economy. So now I'm going to deviate into some stuff that's not in the old book, but coming in the new one. And again, I know you can't read this in the back, but this is a diagram of the social economy. How many of you have heard that term? Good. How many of you can define that term? Yeah, no, it's another one just like sustainable development. It's like, oh dear. So definitions of social economy have evolved in recent years. The term was first used in 18th century Europe to describe the intellectual foundations of the cooperative movement. Today, social economy is defined in a variety of ways, but they share similar themes. Most definitions build from the fundamental concept of the simultaneous pursuit of economic and social objectives through citizen-owned enterprises, cooperatives, credit unions, nonprofit organizations, service associations, and charities. The social economy is often differentiated between public and private sector economy by its integration of social goals, reciprocity, and solidarity into economic decisions. So it can also be conceived of as the third system of the economy, and that's what this diagram is trying to show. So those of you up front can see it, the rest of you can see it in the next edition of the book. The first system represents the private sector and is primarily profit-driven, while the second system is the domain of the public sector and is focused on redistribution and planning. And the third system is about citizens taking action to meet and satisfy needs themselves and working together in some collaborative way to do this. And it's based upon the principles of self-help and mutuality, of caring for others and of meeting social needs rather than the maximization of profit. So let me give you a few examples. This is the Greystone Bakery in Yonkers, New York, which has been in operation for 30 years started by the Greystone Foundation. It's worked to create jobs and housing opportunities for a community with the largest concentration of poverty in the otherwise affluent Westchester County. It employs 65 workers who were formerly homeless or incarcerated. The foundation's also helped to establish local HIV and AIDS programs, family service programs, job training, and so on. And if you can see his lapel, it says gluten-free. Many communities are benefiting from community-supported agriculture, which allows both growers and consumers to share responsibilities of cultivating a vibrant local food system. And typically, local farmers on the urban fringe will grow food for a group of city resident subscribers who will pay in advance for a share of the produce. Inspired by community-supported agriculture, several North American communities have established community-supported fisheries. Again, where small-scale and often family-run fishing operations provide freshly caught local seafood to local markets. And this is particularly important in supporting independent small-scale fishing in an industry which is dominated by big business and aquaculture. An example of the social economy can be seen in the province of Saskatchewan, where it helped the Lac La Ronge First Nation become a key business owner in its region through the creation of the Kitsaki Development Corporation. Community development corporations are nonprofit organizations that support community economic development by offering financial services, educational programs, affordable housing, investing directly in starting and operating enterprises, and/or providing other services. In the Kitsaki case, the CDC helped create a socially positive economic base from which to improve the livelihood of the Lac La Ronge people. For decades before the establishment of Kitsaki in 1981, many of the jobs in this north-central region of the province were controlled by businesses in southern Saskatchewan. Many of the jobs did not benefit locals, and most of the profits were spent outside of the region. So to bolster economic development in the region, Kitsaki fostered social enterprise through a joint venture strategy that combines community ownership with private sector partners. Examples of their enterprises include wild rice processing, smoked meats, insurance, and trucking. And through the Kitsaki, over 500 jobs have been created, of which 70% are held by Aboriginal people, and annual revenues now average $50 million. Co-housing is another area that's rapidly been gaining popularity throughout North America as a result of dissatisfaction with the design of conventional residential developments. And this housing alternative is serving the needs of people of varying incomes by providing tangibles such as shared facilities, help with childcare and meal preparation, as well as intangibles such as a sense of community, support, and a feeling of security. Some of you might recognize this. This is called BEDZ, or Beddington Zero Energy Development. It's an environmentally friendly 99-home housing development near London, in the London borough of Sutton. And the reason I put it up here, not just because it's green, but because the reason it was built at all was because it was not built by a conventional developer. It was initiated by the Peabody Trust, so essentially a social economy actor here. You might get the theme that I'm trying to show you here. So here in Montreal, Bixby bikes, and I've seen this now just in several other cities, London and Boston recently, similar things. So you don't need a bike if you're in an urban core. You can just rent one of these. You just swipe your credit card. You pay by the half hour, or you don't have to put it back in the same place. It's quite amazing. Car sharing. This is becoming quite popular. And there are municipalities are playing along by providing preferred parking spaces for shared cars. So this is shared car ownership, usually by a co-op or a private firm. This is not a new idea. This is a picture from the 1940s. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Join a car sharing club today. So we're not totally reinventing the wheel here. But car sharing is really gaining in popularity. You can just see from these figures that it's really growing. And where it's going next, this is quite interesting, is it's not just the Zip cars and the motos. People are renting out or sharing their own cars. So now you can do this. This is you can actually rent from somebody in your community, and you can do it on your cell phone. So this is the new paradigm, and it's going to have a huge impact. And already we're seeing it in economic reporting and also in polling. The younger generation in particular are saying, well, you know what? I don't really want a car. I can have any car I want. If I want a BMW for date night, I can get that. If I want a van for moving on Saturday, I can get that. And I can pay hourly. I don't need to buy a car. And this is obviously scaring the bejesus out of the auto industry, but I mean, that's where that's going. And people are also saying, hey, you know what? Housing's just ridiculously expensive. I want to look at a cooperative or some kind of shared ownership scheme. So we are starting to think about sharing in a way that we haven't before, or haven't for a long time. And it's something that I think needs a lot more attention by people who are doing economic development. Now, I want to sort of try to pull this all together to say, how do you think about all of these things in some kind of framework? Because as I said, I track these kinds of initiatives. They're fascinating. But all of you come from a community where you're going to say, yeah, but not in my community. My community is unique. And every community is unique, and that's true, and that's a really important thing about sustainable or community economic development. But we have to be able to make some generalizations, otherwise we can't learn from each other and we can't learn from our mistakes. So I use this concept, and some people are using something similar this morning, of community capital. And really, our undergraduate students were talking about asset-based community development. That's really what this is. It makes much more sense to us that we would focus on assets rather than deficiencies. So we think of community in terms of capital, and in terms of sustainable community development, we say that strengthening community capital for sustainable community development means focusing on 6 forms of capital. And graphically, it looks like this, and I'm just going to run through these quickly so you can see what I mean by natural, physical, economic, human, social, and cultural. that are joined together by community mobilization. So what's natural capital? That's really about minimizing the consumption of essential natural capital. That means living within ecological limits, conserving and enhancing natural resources, sustainable resource management of soil, air, water, energy, agriculture, and so on, cleaner production, and minimizing solid, liquid, and air pollution waste. Natural capital is a term that's quite well known. Physical capital. Improving physical capital includes focusing on community assets such as public facilities like schools and hospitals, water and sanitation, efficient transportation, safe quality housing, adequate infrastructure, and communications. Strengthening economic capital means focusing on making more with less, making use of existing resources, for example, using waste as a resource, making the money go around, circulating dollars within a community, making things ourselves, import replacement, making something new, creating new products, and trading fairly with others. So community financial institutions are very key here. But also increasing human capital requires a focus on areas such as health, education, nutrition, literacy, and family and community cohesion. And there are some basic determinants of health that we make it easier for us to do this in most of your communities than in some strife-torn communities in other parts of the world and in actually some of our Aboriginal communities here. So we also need to have peace, safety, food, shelter, education, income, and employment as prerequisites for increasing human capital. Multiplying social capital, and if you can see the picture here, you can see how hard it is to get a good image for social capital, but it requires attention to effective and representative local governance, strong organizations, capacity building, participatory planning, access to information, and collaboration and partnerships. And lastly, and this builds nicely on the presentation just before lunch, enhancing cultural capital implies attention to traditions and values, heritage and place, the arts, diversity, and social history. This is particularly important in communities with a long reach, in ethnic communities, in Aboriginal communities. A lot of people who use a similar kind of community capital framework lump social and community and cultural capital together. And it was working with Indigenous people, and particularly in Latin America, who pointed out to me that, you know, for us, culture is everything, and it's its own form of capital, and they convinced me of that. So the framework that I use is that sustainable development requires mobilizing citizens and their governments to strengthen all 6 of these forms of community capital. And community mobilization is necessary to coordinate, balance, and catalyze community capital. So after much mulling the last few years about whether anybody would read a book in 2012, I decided that I would do a 4th edition of Towards Sustainable Communities. It's coming out 20 years now after the first edition. And there are postcards around the room, and the publisher wants me to tell you that Saturday is the deadline for the 20% pre-publication discount. So act fast, and you will get that. But it's interesting. I thought really hard about whether to do this as a book or an app, or you know, what is a book? What's a resource book in 2012? So I'm quite excited about how this has turned out. It is completely revised and updated, as you would expect, and all of the previous editions have been too, but it's much more graphically oriented than previous editions. So, I mean, what have I been doing for the last 5 years, or since 2005? I do these PowerPoint presentations that are all pictures. So I realized, my goodness, I have not put enough energy into focusing on visual images. So this book has 200 illustrations, and I'm just really pleased that I, for once, put the energy into illustrations, because I think it really makes a difference. There are new chapters, as well as the whole book being updated. So there's a focus on food secure communities. I mean, amazingly enough, when I was writing the 2005 edition in 2004, food was not nearly the issue that it is now. It's really, I mean, it was for some people, but now everybody's talking about food. I must get a dozen applications from graduate students every year who want to focus on food security or food sovereignty and those kinds of issues. Green building. Again, somehow, I mean, it's great to have a fourth shot at a book. Somehow I didn't have a chapter on green buildings in the last edition. I did have some reference to them, but now there's a whole chapter because so much has happened in the field. And there's a chapter on communities integrating sustainability, because one of the things that I've argued in the previous editions was that many communities were doing wonderful initiatives around one of these sectors, whether it be economic development or food or transportation or recycling, but they weren't pulling it all together. And now we have examples that are very inspiring of communities that are really seeing this as a new way to proceed, a new way of shaping their vision and their future, and they are pulling it together. The book also describes a new online community capital tool, which I'll talk about more in a minute. And for those of you who are particularly interested in following up on this kind of work, when Scott was introducing the morning, first thing this morning, he was talking about the whole notion of linking researchers with practitioners and making research relevant. And that's particularly important in this field. It's what I have been focusing a lot of my life about. So there's a new program that for mobilizing collaboration around sustainable community development for researchers and practitioners. It's called Pando, and you can find it at pando.sc for sustainable communities. And we will be launching that globally in June at the Rio Earth Summit. So, as I said, this is the framework that I've laid out for you. Let me give you an example of how we've used the tool. This is a community in Saskatchewan called Crake, smaller than even some of the ones you've talked about this morning. The population was about 400, and their concern was over viability, because obviously when you get down to that level and the last teacher leaves, or the last nurse, or the last firefighter, last doctor, whatever, you're in big trouble. So they were considering conventional economic development options. And honestly, the state of conventional economic development is that their preferred option, their only option when they started this project, was to put a gas station on the freeway exit closest to them. I don't know about you folks. I hope you're not still proposing stuff like that, but I just find that incredibly sad. Fortunately, somebody in Crake came to a lecture something like this in Saskatoon and came back and said, you know what, this sounds really wacky, but why don't we do something completely different and try building an eco-center? And after much discussion, they decided to do that. And this is what it looks like. And it uses straw bale technology and solar water heating. And they've done all kinds of really interesting things with it. It was pretty much all volunteer. But they did some very interesting things. Like the guy who figured out the solar hot water system now has a revitalized business converting people's water heating to solar hot water all over southern Saskatchewan. So it really influenced the trades. It's influenced behavior change. People are wanting solar hot water for their own houses. And they also made an arrangement with the municipality to get some land nearby this center and say, okay, we will, whoops, I can do that. We will make parcels available for $1 for anyone who comes and builds a house off-grid in the next 3 years. And you know what? Their population has gone up. People are coming. So I don't know if it's the end of the story. I mean, Saskatchewan in general is improving its economic fortunes for other reasons. But part of why they were able to do that was going through an exercise much like this. So you can, again, I'm sorry in the back, you're not going to be able to see this very well, but the Community Capital tool is two instruments. It's a scan and a balance sheet. And the scan will shortly be available for free. So if you go to Pando, you'll find out how to get there. But it uses that same hexagon that you saw earlier, and it breaks those capitals up into stocks. And then it breaks the stocks up into indicators. And again, I don't have time to go into any detail here, but I just want to give you some images of what it looks like. And so some examples of the scan, you can start to use this particularly for decision support. So if you are Crake and you're trying to say, okay, what if we build the gas station, or what if we build the eco center? We don't have the resources or the energy to do both. What would it mean for all 6 of these forms of capital? And you can see in this case that, well, in this case, cultural capital, the inner line is kind of the baseline. So in this case, whatever is being proposed here, everything would improve or be stable, but it would particularly help human capital and cultural capital. You might get another diagram where it says this would be good for human capital, it would be bad for natural capital. So what this does is it forces us in a very simple and easy way to keep these 6 forms of capital in mind, because you get a visual picture very quickly. Because we all talk about integration all the time, but at the end of the day, we break it up into the social, the environmental, and the economic, and we don't integrate. And really, my whole point is that we need to integrate. The tool also gives you these scatter diagrams, so you can see very, very quickly where people agree and disagree. And you can go, you know what? We don't really need to talk about that issue because it turns out we all agree on it. These are the ones we need to focus on. Or these are the issues that we agree on. Let's, rather than focusing on what we disagree, let's focus on how we can move forward on these issues. So this kind of thing I think is really great, especially for communities that are feeling consultation fatigue, because it's really simple, it's really easy, and again, it's free. You can all access it. Not quite yet, but very soon, and it'll be constantly updated, and we're really pleased about this. And I think it's not a moment too soon, because really, for the first time, what am I doing for time? Close. Since Sustainable Development's 25th, since it was started and popularized in 1987, we're really starting to see some pushback. We're seeing it, as I said, in local economic development and sustainability officers who are getting pushback from their communities. So we need to find better ways to include people in developing a shared analysis, because that's the only way we can develop a shared vision and a shared agenda. In the US, the pushback, like everything else, is more extreme, and I feel compelled to tell you about this. In January of this year, the US Republican National Committee passed a resolution exposing, quote unquote, Agenda 21 as a comprehensive plan of extreme environmentalism, social engineering, and global political control. Now, there's nothing new there. I mean, this is the Tea Party, and they've always considered the United Nations a front for some kind of a one-world government conspiracy. And you could laugh them off as a bunch of wingnuts, except that we're talking about the Republican National Committee and Fox News. Think back to Joe McCarthy and what he was able to do. But what's really remarkable about it is that they're not just attacking Agenda 21, they're attacking local sustainability. Quote, Agenda 21 is being covertly pushed into local communities through the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, ICLEI, through local sustainable development policies such as Smart Growth, Wildlands Project, Resilient Cities, Regional Visioning Projects, and other green or alternative projects, end of quote. So as one commentator puts it, these individuals have interpreted the UN's Agenda 21 as an international plot implemented by a town hall near you to herd humanity into habitation zones and save the rest for the animals at the behest of enviro-fascists and their bicycle advocate shock troops. I hope you're laughing at that, but the results actually are quite serious. Tea Party activists are railing against efforts to control sprawl and conserve energy. Cities, towns, and counties are cutting off financing for measuring and reducing carbon emissions. Some local governments are ceasing payment of dues to ICLEI and withdrawing from climate action plans. Some US states have even gone so far as to make it illegal for local governments to join ICLEI. Now, the Tea Party accuses ICLEI, among other NGOs, of disseminating the UN's instructions to local communities. I have known ICLEI for a really long time, and most people don't know anything about it, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about it because I think it's important that you know. I was at the founding conference of ICLEI in 1990. ICLEI's Secretary General is writing the foreword for my book. I'm launching the book at the ICLEI World Congress in Brazil in June. So I can tell you this, the Tea Party perspective is not only ludicrous, there is no respect for fact. It is completely fabricated. But I've been amazed to hear otherwise sensible people talk about ICLEI in the same breath as the UN and the World Bank and the IMF. So what is ICLEI? It's an NGO. It's an association of, by, and for local governments. It was founded in 1990, and its first major global contribution was to provide a voice for local governments at the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. So thanks to ICLEI, Agenda 21 was accompanied by a parallel process called Local Agenda 21. And although local sustainability goes under different names in different countries, such as ICSPs or Integrated Community Sustainability Plans in Canada, there's no question that most of the action and traction on the sustainability front for the last 20 years has been at the local level, as well as with NGOs and some businesses. But certainly we've had next to nothing from national governments. But many thousands of local governments around the world have implemented sustainability plans and initiatives over the last 2 decades, demonstrating, very importantly, that national level sustainability is possible and indeed desirable. So, wingnuts though they may be, the Tea Party challengers are providing us an important opportunity for sober reflection, which we should use to learn together how we can be more effective in the face of ideological opposition to sustainability. And one of the points I want to raise is this, that we need to frame sustainability positively, and it's one of my concerns about all the focus on climate action. Climate action is all about don't. Don't do this, reduce your that, bad, 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 no, no, no. People feel hectored and they feel lectured at and they feel guilty. Sustainability is about what we can do, what we should do to not only be sustainable in the sense of maintaining, but in terms of becoming a better society. Second, you people will appreciate this more than some other audiences, but let's not just immediately jump to say they should pass a law. When markets work, use them. But they don't always work. And when they don't work, then we have to look at voluntary initiatives, we have to look at public expenditures. And when we have a good case for regulation, then we should not be afraid to regulate. And finally, examples from elsewhere may inspire. I should know, that's what I do for a living. But visioning and planning has to be based on and engage local knowledge. People are not happy enough seeing images of Vancouver or Portland or Stockholm or whatever. They want to see their own community. And again, that's where this community capital tool is important. We also need to make sure we maintain the focus on integration, that really sustainable community development is about integrating the economic, social, and ecological dimensions of development. When your MP comes in this afternoon and talks about economic sustainability or environmental sustainability or social sustainability, anybody who says that, to me, that means they don't get it. They're immediately breaking it up. And it's hard to deal with it in a macro sense, but we have to look at it all together. If we can do that, and if we can improve the language, because quite frankly, after 25 years, we've done fabulous work in the area of sustainable development and sustainable communities, but a lot of people still struggle. They don't know what the heck we're talking about. We use terms like sustainable consumption, again, the people who get it, the people who don't. We need to get some better language so that we can really make this more mainstream, so we can see images like this. He could be the one, he drives a hybrid, but does he compost? Thank you very much. So we have time for a couple of questions, so go ahead. Or comments or complaints. Yes.
How would you define social equity in the Canadian context?
How would I define social equity in the Canadian context was the question. Again, so the language that I used was talking about fairness. I do think we have to think globally, and the Canadian context is part of being on the planet. So I do think we have to see it globally. We do have to see it in our communities, and we have to see it in the future as well as now. So what does that specifically mean? That's where I think you have to look at it at the community level. I mean, there's certainly a role for federal policy, but I don't think that's a priority right now of our federal leaders. So I think we need to look at that, and there are lots of different ways to approach it. So for example, at the community level, you might say in your community that affordable housing is a key part of social equity, and it's important. But how that gets done, there's lots of opportunities. So you might say, okay, we want a target of 10% of our housing stock being affordable as defined by some certain measure. Well, there's lots of ways you could do that. You could do that by granny suites spread out over the whole community. You could do that in one gigantic building that had all the social housing in it. There's lots of ways you could do it. So having people involved in finding a way to do that, I think is really important. And again, you have to engage people, because if they feel like it's being imposed upon them, they feel like it's ideological, they're going to push back. And so I think that's the key to it. I know that wasn't probably exactly the answer to your question, but that's how I would approach it. Yeah. Yes, in the back.
I'm going to use the mic. Since
Sorry?
it's here. Sure. Thank you for the presentation. Great, I enjoy it. You speak about the environmental, social, and economic sustainability. I will ask you to comment about the political sustainability we are facing today. Last night at the town hall here, I hear the Farmer Union Federations about the new free trade that is being discussed with the European Union and Canada, which is going to remove all the decision-making even from the local level and affect our future of food security, food in general, many things. And it's done in secrecy. We also see in the federal government politics toward questioning the role of a non-profit sector about political sort of agenda. And so we see that we are facing a political issue, then at least we address that all the effort that we're putting in the other three areas are going to be drained. So how you respond to a role in the political arena?
Well, certainly, thank you for the question. So my approach, I mean, one of the key things that we've learned from 20 or 25 years of looking at local sustainability, as I said in my concluding remarks, the traction has not been from senior governments. It's been at the community level. It's important to be involved in those political battles to the extent that they affect your sector and your interests. But in terms of really demonstrating that sustainability is possible and desirable, I'm not holding my breath anymore, and haven't been for a long time, for enlightenment at 24 Sussex or 1600 Pennsylvania. That's clearly not where things are happening. And at some point, in my view, I mean, that graph I showed you with the arrow busting through the bottom, I mean, there's going to be a moment someday when people in positions of authority are going to go, oh my God, we are really screwed up here. And then they're going to be looking for models of what works and what can be scaled up and what can be transferred. And that's why we need to show what can be done and show it at the community level. The Rio Earth Summit, for example, all these governments are going to show up in June. Do I think that anything useful is going to come out of that? Not really. Not from the governments themselves. I think that's going to be a bomb, and I think everybody knows that. But the global attention to the issues and the fact that it's a way to mobilize all of this bottom-up activity from labor, from business, from NGOs, from communities, I think that's where the real leadership is, and we just have to keep working on creating the people who will actually be those leaders at some point, because clearly our leaders now are either unwilling, unable to take us in the right direction.
Just to follow up.
Last question.
You know, a number of the examples you gave were public sector
We're gonna
examples.
need to cut it off.
A number of the people that are here are from the public sector. Most of the people from here are from the public sector. They're engaged in sustainability issues. I think it's a little short-sighted of you to say that the public sector will not be the leader in this ultimately, because it's not the private sector that's going to lead us towards a sustainable, future. It's going to be public initiative and politics that will lead us through there. And I think when you look through the examples you gave us of housing in different places, of the windmill on the waterfront in Toronto, all of those have some root in the public sector where we as taxpayers got together and said, we're going to contribute to something that will create a sustainable future. So I really think you're selling that short, and that politics is really an important part of this process, and we all have to understand that and get involved in it a little bit more.
Sorry, so just briefly to clarify, no, I didn't mean to say the public sector wasn't going to lead us. I meant the federal political leadership, which I distinguish from the public sector. And in fact, the reason I focus on municipal and local governments is because that is public sector, and that is really where it's happening. But it's happening because it's not just the public sector, it's the public sector in cooperation and collaboration with the whole community.
We're going to leave it on that controversial point. Mark does have a plane to catch, but we can certainly get you in touch with him afterwards via email. I'm sure he'd love to continue the conversation that way. We're going to take a very brief 10-minute bio break, so just stretch, refresh, and we want to thank Mark for coming all this way from Vancouver to speak with us today. Thanks, Mark.